Quality aspects in finished garments. After finishing every garment, it is good to check on all the quality aspects and, if possible, correct the mistakes. In some cases, it might not be possible to make corrections as there may not be excess fabric to make the garment bigger if the measurements are too small, or the fabric will show holes at the outside by opening the previous stitches. At the end of the session, you will be able to assess quality of finished garments, explain the techniques to support quality of finished garments. Now, let's see the aspects to be considered for assessing the quality of finished garments. First, check if the measurements are as initially planned. Also note that seam allowances need to be subtracted while doing so. Check if the measurements of seam allowances and hem allowances are as initially planned. See if the seams are clean and even, with only one seam line or more neatly next to another. As you can see in this example here, there are 3 stitched lines which are not evenly parallel. They even cross each other. Also, the seam allowance is not uniform throughout. One thread is in a different color. See if the seam allowances are sewn parallel and the 2 layers of cloth have been aligned evenly. Ensure that the hemmed edges and the seams have been joined in the right way. Check if the top stitch at the fold is neat and close to the fold. Make sure that the reverse stitch is clean and there are only 2 to 3 lines of stitches on top of another. Verify if the product has been ironed well at the end. Next, we will see some techniques that support in enhancing quality of finished garments. When sewing a seam, if 2 layers of fabric are slippery, use pins to hold the 2 layers together. Sometimes, if pinning the fabric is not enough, then you can additionally hold the fabric with a temporary tacking stitch and then remove it later. Sometimes, if you have difficulties keeping the folded hem in place while sewing, press with the iron and keep fold in place with pins. Sometimes, you may also have difficulties keeping the seam and seam allowance parallel. In such a case, you can mark the seam parallel to the seam allowance with tailor's chalk, measuring tape, and tailor's square. To ensure even and parallel seam allowance, tape a sticker next to the foot of your machine and mark the different seam allowances like 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3 by 4 inch, and 1 inch from the point of the needle as shown. Sometimes, after the final ironing of the product, the fabric shrinks. As you can see here, the chest measurement of the petticoat was supposed to be 14 inches, but here it is less than 14 inches. So make sure you pre-shrink the fabric before drafting. In this session, we have seen the aspects to be considered for assessing the quality of finished garments and the techniques that support the quality of finished garments. Before we conclude, let's take a look at the key points. The aspects to be considered for assessing the quality of finished garments are: check if the measurements of the finished garment are as initially planned. See if seam allowances are sewn parallel and the two layers of cloth are aligned evenly. Make sure that the reverse stitch is clean and there are only 2 to 3 lines of stitches on top of another. If the two layers of fabric are slippery when sewing a seam, use pins to hold the fabric together. Check if the fabric was not pre-shrunk before drafting and cutting, but shrank after ironing the finished garment. With that, we've come to the end of this session.